Hey everyone, and welcome to our DAT IQ weekly market update. This is our update for May 4th, 2021. I'm Ken Adamo, Chief of Analytics, joined as always by Dean Croak, who's our Principal Industry Analyst, and Ned Damon, who's our Principal Data Scientist. May the 4th be with you both. I flubbed it. How you doing?
It's good to be with you.
Yeah.
Are you a big Star Wars fan, guys?
I'm more of a Star Trek guy.
Or Star Trek?
More Star Trek or Babylon 5. I really like Babylon 5, but we're not. Let's not go down the rabbit hole here.
Let's not go down the rabbit hole. I'm a big Star Wars fan. Not of the most recent three. It was not my cup of tea, but what are you going to do? So for those unfamiliar with the show, we do not talk about Star Wars. We do not talk about pop culture. We're here to talk about freight data and analytics and what we're seeing in the freight market. We're here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Eastern, 7 a.m. Pacific. It's usually the three of us, and then sometimes we have a guest. Sometimes we're going to roll a few clips like we are today for some long-form sit-down interviews. But by and large, we're here to make sure you have the information you need to make the best decisions in your business. So with that, we have a pretty full show today. I'm going to get us started in a second with our key points of the week, but I also want to let you know that we really appreciate if you drop some comments into the chat or comment section below. We will do our best to answer as many questions as we can at the end of the show, but it helps us if you get them in early so that our team can sift through them and pop them over to us so that we can walk through that. So our key points of this week, we have a lot going on. So flatbed on an absolute tear. Dean will cover that in more detail with charts and graphs. Just a kind of calendar check. It's road check week. So we're expecting capacity to tighten. We have Mother's Day coming up. Make sure you buy a card. That's also going to have some freight implications. And then a little later in the month, we have the deferred tax filing deadline, which will happen later this month. It's also the 1-year anniversary this week, I believe, later this week, May 10th-ish, of when the truckers were protesting in Washington, D.C. for low rates. Quite a reversal in the market since then. So it's actually been almost $1 a mile, if not more, in some markets since then. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dean, who's going to walk us through our market update.
Yep. Thanks, Ken. We'll get started with the load board activity, first of all, in dry van. Last week, market volumes increased last week as a result of sort of that end-of-month phenomenon we see where shippers clear their docks. Volumes are up 5% week over week. Truck posts dropped, not surprisingly. Capacity did tighten a little bit, so the load-to-truck ratio it just moved down slightly to about 4.93. In refrigerated, the load-to-truck ratio in refrigerated, after dropping for the last 3 weeks in a row at reverse course last week, increased up to 10.66 loads per truck. Load post volumes last week, not surprisingly, increased by 11%. Produce season's upon us. Capacity tightened. There were 6% fewer trucks posting their equipment. In the flatbed sector, flatbed load post volumes are more than double where they were at the start of this year, and they're more than 4 times higher than the same week last year. So, and they're now also 21% higher than the highest level reached in 2018. Just to give you a sense of how much volume there is in the flatbed spot market. Last week, load post volumes increased only by 3%. But there were 7% fewer truck posts. So what that did is it pushed the flatbed load-to-truck ratio through the 100 level for the first time this year, now at 102.68, and just slightly higher than where it was in 18, as you can see from the chart compared to the blue line. In the market condition index charts, we'll have a look at dry van first. Average spot rates in the top 10 markets dropped slightly, only by a penny per mile to about 245. That's despite a 2% increase in volume. It's this time of the year when we start to see produce impact dry van capacity, which is somewhat counterintuitive, but a lot of dry van capacity will switch over to refrigerated because the reefer carriers can, of course, haul both dry van and reefer freight. A lot of really good high seasonal freight rates in the produce sector. Florida is a really good example this week of the impact on the dry van sector. A lot of flowers and vegetables coming out of the Lakeland market. Average outbound dry rates are up 7 cents a mile out of Lakeland to 207. Just south in Miami, average dry van rates are up 11 cents a mile to $1.90. Further west in Los Angeles and Ontario, capacity was tight. Rates moved up only by about a penny per mile to all destination markets, but on the really busy, it's almost a backhaul. It's almost a return trip lane, although there's not a lot of backhaul freight coming out of Phoenix. Rates surged to $4.54 a mile on the LA to Phoenix lane last week, and of course, there's a lot of e-commerce retail fulfillment activity on that lane. Just a quick update on the port congestion we've been talking about for months. It appears to be easing both on the import and the number of vessels at anchor. Average wait time is down to 6.8 days from 8 days a few weeks ago. According to the import exchange, there were 22 vessels at anchor yesterday versus 0 this time last year and 40 in late January. So the number of vessels is easing. There's 15 container ships due in the next 3 days, which is 2 fewer than normal. So there's a real sense that things are easing and throughput is increasing on the West Coast. Having a look at the refrigerated market condition index, again, produce markets dominates the freight market for most of the next few weeks, certainly until July. Spot rates in the top 10 markets were up 6 cents a mile. Volumes were up about 6% week over week. Miami and Lakeland are in the top 10. They're also, Miami's the number 1 spot this week. And of course, it's Mother's Day, as Ken mentioned. Volumes out of Miami were up 31% week over week. That pushed spot rates up 27 cents a mile to $2.73 on average. Last week and this week are the peak shipping weeks for Mother's Day flowers. About 90% of all flowers, carnations, roses, lilies, all come into Miami. And of course, you've also got produce season. This is the final month of the big produce push out of Florida. It starts to get too hot for a lot of the vegetables and fruits. So in Lakeland, volumes are up 34% week over week. Outbound rates out of Lakeland were up 14 cents a mile to an average of $2.35. Very little change in load volumes on the West Coast, but capacity tightened in Los Angeles, up 7 cents a mile to $3.41 in the reefer sector. Having a look at the flatbed market condition index, certainly having an unprecedented year as rates in the top 10 markets increased by 18 cents a mile last week. And that's despite volumes dropping by 7% week over week in the spot market. That's a sign of just how tight capacity is in the flatbed sector. I'd like to have a look at Memphis in the middle of the country. It's the largest logistics freight hub in the US. Volumes were up 3% week over week. Rates are up 13 cents a mile to $2.53. That's excluding fuel. In our biggest flatbed market in Houston, volumes are down 5% week over week, but spot rates were up 17 cents a mile to $2.70. And there was a similar trend on the East Coast in Savannah. Volumes dropped 9% week over week, while rates increased 13 cents a mile to $3.13. So wrapping up now with our year-over-year look at spot rates, we'll start with dry van. Dry van spot rates dropped another 2 cents a mile last week to end April at $2.29. That's excluding fuel. And compared to the same week last year, rates are now 94 cents a mile higher. And the benchmark year is, of course, 2018, when capacity was tight. Spot rates are 46 cents a mile higher in the dry van sector. Having a look at the refrigerated sector now, spot rates last week increased. Produce season heats up, of course. We've got a lot of volume of flowers and strawberries coming off the West Coast. Spot rates increased 2 cents a mile to an average of $2.63. They're up 94 cents a mile higher compared to last year, and almost 50 cents a mile higher than this time in 18. And wrapping up with our flatbed year-over-year look at spot rates, in what can only be described as an unprecedented flatbed rate rally. Spot rates continued climbing last week, moving up another 4 cents to $2.62, excluding fuel. For context, flatbed rates are now 93 cents a mile higher than the same week last year, 30 cents a mile higher than the same week in 2018, and also 16 cents a mile higher than the highest rate reached in 2018. So that's it for this week's market update. If you'd like to learn more about what's happening in freight, go to dat.com/market update, and you can download our detailed weekly report. Over to you, Ned, for the forecast.
All right. I hope people are ready for a tale of 3 cities, as it were, even though the analogy doesn't quite work. We're going to begin by looking at the forecast for dry van, which is downish, but still pretty straightforward. You can see the blue line shows the observed market rate by DAT. And then off to the right, you can see our 4 strands of spaghetti, although it only looks like 3 right now. In green, you can see the rate cast model. In red, you can see our short-term model, and in gold and silver, you can see our 2 blended forecasts, which are mixtures of the 2 model in different amounts and in different ways. The short-term model is expecting there to be a continued slide down and to the right, whereas the ratecast model is expecting rates to kind of hold their current position, and then that seasonal effects will buoy the dry van rate up heading into the summer, with the blended forecasts leaning more towards the short term and then flattening out as we get into the start of June. Next, we're going to be moving to the reefer forecasts. Reefer forecasts are the kind of middle of the three cities. You can see in blue the actuals observed by DAT, and then off to the right, the short term in red, assuming kind of a flat market. Ratecast holding at about the same, with a little bit of growth as we head into the middle and later parts of May and into June, and the blended forecast leaning more towards the ratecast model as we head out into the June period. Finally, we're going to be moving to the flatbed forecast. Once again, in blue are the actuals. In red is our short-term model, which is basically projecting a continued upward pressure on flatbed rates, just straight up and to the right, with some seasonal with a little bit of wiggle, but mostly just up and to the right. Green is our ratecast model, which is expecting seasonal behaviors to somewhat assert themselves and start dragging flatbed rates slightly back down to earth, but there's still a fair bit of upside that it sees heading into June. And then the blended forecast leaning more towards the short-term model in this period. And I think that conversation about what's going to be happening going forward brings us to a wonderful interview that we did with Geoff Turner from Chop Tank.
What are you seeing so far in calendar year 21, and what's your outlook for the rest of the year?
Yeah, it's certainly interesting in the sense that I don't know what back to normal is. We were coming out of sort of a roller coaster as it was prior to COVID. So when you start thinking about the more fundamentals and you look at the freight market right now, everybody is in that I see, all of our shippers and all of our carriers are really, really busy, and most of our carriers don't have any extra capacity. Most of our customers are looking for any capacity you can give them. So as we, and you really think about it, the economy truly isn't fully back online yet. So when you start thinking about when the economy sort of gets back to where we know it will be, you start thinking about people traveling again and getting out, and you think about the trillions of dollars of sort of stimulus money that's went into the economy. I don't really see many speed bumps ahead of us if as long as sort of COVID dies away a little bit. So it's going to be a robust freight market for some time, in my opinion.
That was a really awesome conversation with Geoff. I think he's one of the best in the industry. He's been around a while. He's seen the ups and downs. I really enjoyed talking with him. So I would recommend checking out that's somewhere someone can help point to where it is on our site. I think it's dat.com/podcasts. But it was about a half an hour conversation. Highly recommend if you're interested in sort of decomposing what happened over the last 18 months and really thinking about what's going to happen over the next 12 plus. Really recommend giving that a listen. It was really great, and I thank Geoff for joining us. So, Ned, do you want to hit us with a question for the week?
Absolutely. So the question that we have for this week, as soon as I pull up the actual text so that I'm not just going off of memory, up to $4 a mile flatbed rates. What's different compared to 2018?
This one's a Dean lead-in. That's Dean Croak's music.
Yeah, that would be the sound of an engine brake. It's a fascinating thing. I really started to dig into the freight market late 17, and then of course I was living through the early part of 18, and it was mostly you come out of the 17 period, we had some big Cat 5 hurricanes, a lot of wind damage down south, a lot of rebuilding effort. Then we had changes in the tax code. We had oil prices were booming, a lot of industrial economic stimulus. So flatbed really was just on a tear, and I distinctly remember the rate view charts showing that spot rates were higher than contract in flatbed, which is unusual, but they were higher than contract for the first 7 months of the year. Then, of course, it started to fall away. This year, it's like the indicators are the same in terms of load to truck ratio, load post capacity, albeit at a little higher elevation compared to 18. They're tracking seasonally the same. But what's different, though, this isn't an industrial-driven economy. This is a consumer demand-driven economy, and the two are very different from the type of freight hauled. So they're the big differences in the two, but because of the pandemic, we've got this unprecedented demand in building activities for homes that are more tech savvy and in rural areas, so people can, live and work and eat and sleep and exercise more at home. So that's driving a lot of this demand for lumber and building materials that's offsetting the decrease in manufacturing volumes that we've seen. So that's kind of a high level, but there's some possible headwinds coming for flatbed carriers. The National Association of Home Builders have been lobbying Congress because the price of a new home is up $36,000 as a result of higher building material costs. And there's some real concern from builders that those that are on fixed price contracts are being forced to absorb these crippling prices. And there's not only crippling prices, of course, but there's delays in getting deliveries done. So a lot of these businesses are at risk as we look further down the economic cycle.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really, sorry not to step all over you, Ken, but I think it's really interesting the degree to which this kind of self-correction happens. But, I have a friend who is in the lumber industry, and he says that they're just making money hand over fist. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that that's going to be changing, at least in the next couple of months.
Right.
No. I mean, So kind of an interesting slant on this is that one of the ways businesses were forced to spend money to avoid, I'll just say it, they were avoiding taxes. There's no real kind of nicer word for it. No one wants to pay taxes. Looking at carbon offsets, and one of the key ways that carbon offsets kind of manifest themselves is protection of timberland. Mm-hmm. So we're actually seeing sort of a totally unrelated, very important decrease in some of the supply in some of the key areas. Someone recommended, I forget who it was, apologies, but it was a podcast that talked about why we don't use southern pine. Dean, can you talk a little bit more about that? It was really interesting.
Yeah, it was
handle on it.
It was Odd Lots. I think it was Dean Stinson who's sort of the guru in that space. But essentially, he said we have a higher dependence on Canadian lumber and lumber from the Pacific Northwest, because the question was asked on his podcast, why don't we use lumber from the southwest of this country or the southeast? And of course, his comment was it doesn't stack well, it bends, it twists, it's not an ideal log for building dimension framed lumber supplies for housing. So we have a higher dependence on this freight that comes in from overseas or other countries, in particular Canada, where most of our volume comes in.
I know I read another article, I'm trying to remember exactly where, that talked about how back during prior administrations, a lot of sawmill capacity was shuttered, and a lot of the smaller sawmills either shuttered ability or just went out of business. And so the ability of the kind of production side of things to expand is kind of doubly limited, where you've got the issue about not enough timber, but then you also have the issue about the sawmills to process that timber into the planks and boards that folks need.
Yeah, it's not a super flexible kind of path to market.
Yeah.
America's energy industry is kind of like a counterpoint to this, has become ultra flexible, right? They can pull up stakes and abandon a shale, the shale sites out west or up in the Utica and at a moment's notice. And then when the price becomes economically viable again, they're back out there, and in a couple of weeks they're producing. Mm-hmm. Right. And that's just, I don't think that operates the same. I don't think you go kind of pick up a sawmill that's been shuttered for 2 years, and all of a sudden 2 weeks later you're cranking out truckloads of 2x4s. Yeah. Maybe I'm wrong. Yeah. Someone in the comments can correct me. I just don't think it works that way.
And to put some numbers around that, Ken, I looked at some of the data on single-family housing starts, which make up the majority of sort of residential dwellings. Over half of them happen in the southeast of the country. This time last year, we built 880,000 homes. In March, we built close to 1.3 million. So we built another roughly 370,000 new single-family homes in March. And I did some really rough back-of-the-envelope math in terms of how many truckloads that translates to. And I figured roughly 5 truckloads per single-family home. So 350,000 homes times 5 truckloads. That's a lot of extra freight that's been moving in the flatbed space.
A term of art, if you want to sound really clever when you do back-of-the-envelope estimation, is you call it Pareto estimation. Pareto.
have to Google that.
It's
Isn't
the
that
same
the
thing.
80-20 rule, as well as the way you can stack up a chart to be
Yeah.
most to least representative?
Oh, sorry, Fermi estimation. There we go. There we are.
Ken 1, Ned 500.
Oof.
All right. We had some really interesting questions come in.
Yes.
But if you have any more, feel free to drop them in. We're more than willing to hang around and answer them if you'd like. But Ned, do you want to?
Yes, we have one from Sorry, I have to lean forward. We have one from MCC Fan 11 who asks, when you mention dollar per mile, does that include deadhead or only loaded?
Loaded. Yep.
Loaded.
Only
Well, it's the price on the loaded, but you have to understand that you're not going to be getting compensated for your deadhead.
Right. So people do negotiate. If you're having to deadhead a fair bit and the market is as tight as it is, sometimes you can squeeze more out of the broker if you are a carrier to compensate for an unexpectedly large deadhead.
Yeah.
Right.
Deadhead is often perceived as a negative thing. It can actually work in your advantage. Can certainly reposition you into a better paying market. You can also negotiate better on the inbound load.
Right. But we aren't, we look at things when we quote, it was the total line haul paid, right?
Yes.
So unless you were getting some sort of post-delivery relocation from your broker or shipper, or you were getting some kind of compensated excess deadhead, you need to consider the total miles you drove, right, as a function of the total amount you came in, because your total rate per mile is going to be lower unless you run it 100% loaded. Unless you're sitting on top of the shipment, is I guess my point. Your observed rate per mile is going to be lower than everything we talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the old denominator there. Question from Elijah. Please don't visit me until next Passover. Do you expect there to be a surge of new drivers in the reefer sector as the economy opens up, or are there new drivers primarily going into flatbed because the market there is so hot? Dean, I feel like this is your song.
Yeah, I don't know where any of the drivers are going to come from for any of the equipment types. So there's a shortage across the board. We covered this last week. There's a shortage of drivers, but there's a shortage of people in a lot of industries, right? So that's not just trucking. But the bigger issue is that a lot of the new students that come into the industry goes through training schools. The two core demographics, 21-year-olds and the baby boom generation, those two population demographics are declining. So we've got a supply issue. But schools are running at 60 to 70% capacity. But to answer the question about, where are the drivers going to come from, the bigger issue is the DMVs, where there's between a 2 and 4 month delay in actually getting your license. So the problem that companies are going to have, because of the lag between when you pass your CDL, you go through the school process, and then you have to get your license through a DMV. If you've signed up and essentially the company has fronted that for you, my concern is in that gap between when you pass a test and you get your license, if it's 4 months, are you really going to stay in the trucking industry? Or do you go off and do something else in between? So there's a real supply issue for drivers. There's going to be a supply of drivers is going to be very tight for the rest of this year by the looks of it.
Elijah has a follow-up. How long do you expect the increases from DOT inspection to hang around?
I think this year it's going to be a lot longer than we normally see. Normally the market corrects in about a week when I go back and look at past years. But think about the polar vortex. It upset a market that was already in tight capacity mode. It took 3 to 4 weeks for that to work its way out. I think this week's capacity crunch from Road Check Week could linger for quite a few weeks.
Yeah, I think it all depends on, this is kind of such a cop-out politician type answer, but the length to which it lingers is probably going to be directly correlated to how much of an impact it has. Right? If it's kind of a meh impact, I think it'll sort of go back and be indistinguishable in a week or so.
Mm-hmm.
It starts today, right, Dean?
Correct. Yep. Last 3 days.
Yeah, so we'll be keeping an eye on things. We get probably 70 to 80,000 dry van spot shipments rolling in every single day. So we should be able to see by tomorrow what's really going on out there.
Yep.
We have a firebomb of a question from John. Are dispatchers outdated?
You may have noticed my rough start to the show today, and I explained that by I was painting my incoming third son's bedroom this morning in a very poorly ventilated room with non-low VOC paint, So this question's kind of hitting me kind of deep at this point. What do you think, Dean?
I didn't realize that there was any question about how important dispatchers were. They play a critical role. So I'm not sure what the context of the question is. I think dispatchers are probably more important than ever, given how tight the supply of drivers is, and the probability of drivers would like to, change companies for higher pay because pay rates are increasing. So I think they're going to play a much more important role in terms of keeping drivers both employed and busy.
Yeah, no, I think that anything you can do to improve the overall productivity of your workforce right now is going to be especially important. Like, you can see that in a lot of fields where you have a much more tail in the tooth to tail ratio. Like, having that tail there to make sure that the tooth can be as efficient as it can be can really help you when there's just you can't just throw more bodies at the problem.
Right.
If you're talking about independent dispatchers, I mean, I'd like to think that, so that is like if you're an independent owner operator and you're using some kind of a dispatch service, I'd like to believe that the DAT and other tools can help you to get yourself loaded and moved more quickly, but I don't think that it's a complete, it's a gone job. I think that there's still a lot of utility in that kind of a field. Dean, do you have anything else to add?
No, I agree. I think there's also a lot of digital transparency in the market these days too. So I think that carriers are seeing a lot more visibility into the market. So yeah, I think that's on the independent side. That's a very important component of their business.
I think too, right? A lot of these digital tools, at least this was my experience in the industry, a load that was easy to cover with a dispatcher, that's going to be the stuff that's primarily getting covered by digital tools, right? Whether it's a digital broker or kind of an internal dispatch, like a AI type dispatch system that companies are putting in. And the good news is that'll free up the dispatchers to cover the harder to cover loads, right? Where let's just say that you're spending an hour, right, covering shipments. If you kind of like slice out an hour and observe what they're doing, and they have 10 shipments to cover, they're probably spending 8 to 10 minutes covering the easiest shipments, and then the rest of the time working on the hazmat team driver where you need TSA clearance because it picks up in an airport, and then it needs to be hazmat rerouted, and you need a lift gate because the consignee doesn't have a dock, right? It's like, find a computer that'll cover that bad boy. It's an art. I don't want to underestimate it. I used to get such an education going and sitting side by side with a dispatcher, one of our more seasoned dispatchers, and just seeing how they did what they did. You're working in a job, at least where I worked, it was 90% rejection on most shipments. So it's not an easy job either.
We have, do we have time for one final question from Stephen?
Yep, go for it.
Any thoughts on the future trend with diesel prices? I'm guessing we're going to see $3.30 to $3.40 per gallon by midsummer.
We just saw the first week-over-week increase in a while, right?
I think it's still around 312, right? Today, I didn't look at the EIA numbers yesterday, but they were pretty flat from memory the last few weeks.
314.
314 it's up to. Okay. I mean, there's a possibility. Ken, normally it depends on, you normally see an increase in refiners moving over to petroleum as people drive more in the summer, but I'm not sure we'll see as much mobility this summer that we normally do. I mean, that's the difference this year is to the extent that people vacation driving their vehicles, consuming more gasoline. I couldn't say with a high degree of certainty that we'll see diesel prices increasing by what you would normally see in summer.
I mean, I think that there's a lot of pent-up demand for like driving and going places, though.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the SUV and truck sales are through the roof, right? People don't really care, it seems like, what their MPG is anymore. My opinion on this is it's probably very narrowly greater than 50%, but I would say probably a greater than 50% chance that we continue to see inflationary pressure on diesel. Just based on even air traffic, right? If we see return to somewhat normal in terms of summertime demand for air. The cargo airlines consume a lot of fuel. Over-the-road traffic, shipping demand being up, right? Full truckload, that's going to be inflationary. I don't see as many deflationary pressures as I do inflationary over the next, 3 to 6 months.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong though, Ken, but isn't it the case that with petroleum distillates, like the uses are complementary rather than competing, right? Like if you're refining raw petroleum into jet fuel, you get more of the other stuff as a byproduct. So that would push it in the other way if jet travel goes way up.
Yeah, but I think what you also got to look at is like the percentage of the pump price of diesel that is based on purely the cost of goods sold, essentially.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. There's a lot of taxes. We've seen sort of it's the what is it? The retail wholesale spread, Dean.
Yeah. Yep.
Has not been is not nearly as elastic as it is with gasoline, and it's becoming, it seems like, ever the more inelastic. So it doesn't seem like some of those savings in terms of the raw cost to produce. So I'm thinking of it more on the demand side and less on the supply side. But I mean, I could be totally wrong. I mean, I haven't really thought critically about energy in 7 years. Right, because you have a fuel surcharge, right? Or in our industry, you have a fuel surcharge. It's kind of a baked-in hedge. It's interesting. If you're a carrier, I know that fuel surcharge doesn't completely and totally make you whole, especially when diesel goes up from an operating cost perspective and things like that. But I don't know, and I've yet to work with anyone in the freight industry that kind of in earnest hedges fuel outside of a fuel surcharge. So we have one more. Do you want to hit it super, super fast?
Yes. Elijah, again, at what point do you expect shippers to begin considering long-term contracts again with carriers in the reefer sector?
Well, they already are considering them. The carriers just aren't playing ball by and large, right? Eventually, the contract prices that will be put in place will ebb back to the spot market. We will see. I'm confident and certain in that we will see
at
volume
some point
eventually.
Yeah.
At some point in the future, we'll shift back to contracts. What's going to have to happen is a long list of things, but primarily you're going to have to see reduced volatility in the spot market. You're going to obviously have to see prices come down in the spot market. You're going to have to start to see increased consistency on the contract side, right? So they want consistency in shipping patterns to be able to give you a consistent rate. So I think a lot of things have to happen, but it will normalize. Now, where it settles is anyone's guess. I just know what direction it will eventually start heading, unless you guys think any differently.
I don't necessarily think any differently. This is not my core area of expertise, but I would say that I remember talking to Chris Kaplos not that long ago and him banging the drum and saying, not completely that the long-term contract is dead, but that at least it's not healthy.
Well, long-term could just mean different things, right? In a world where like long-term ownership of computers and cell phones means a whole different thing, right? My cell phone's ancient and it's 2.5 years old. So we'll sort of see what happens. There are still pressures out there. We're seeing an insane amount of RFP activity across dry van and reefer. Flatbed doesn't see a lot of contract. I mean, it's usually pretty localized, right? You don't see as much contract volume, at least as a percentage of total volume on flatbeds as you do the other two. So, once shippers can sort of get their feet underneath them, that's when you'll start to see things move over. You'll see spot rates come back down. You'll see contract rates normalize. Contract activity will go back up. When I mean that, I mean that the amount of volume moving under contract will go back up. Those will all be signs. We'll be on this show probably around episode 60 or something, 65, talking about how things are starting to normalize and probably showing contract charts, right?
Yeah.
Anything to add before we wrap up this week?
No.
Mother's Day. Remember the important mothers in your life. Don't goof it up.
Yes, make sure you buy a card. They're a little harder to find this year. It seems like pretty much everything, right? If you want to find a nice little outdoor lawn ornament, not as easy to find this year. Pretty much anything at a home improvement store is going to be in short supply. So we thank you for joining us. Again, we're here every Tuesday. Highly recommend checking out Dean's Market Update, Chris Caplis's Freight Vine podcast, Jeff Turner and I's long-form Freight Focus interview, as well as the others we've done. We have Ramona Hood up there. We have Miller Transfer and others. We have more exciting ones coming down the pike as well. And with that, we're going to sign off for the week, and we hope to see you same time, same day next week. Bye, everyone.
Bye, all.